Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Serving Undocumented Students in the College-Going Process. I am your host, Kathy McDonald, Assistant Director for Network Partnerships at the Florida College Access Network. Before we get started with today's presentation, a few quick housekeeping items. First, we welcome your questions. I know many of you are used to using the chat feature on Zoom. We're going to ask that you put your questions through the Q&A function because that way we can keep track of which questions have been answered and which ones haven't. So if you can please do that, we would appreciate it. Second, if you can share what you're learning on social media, we'd love to learn what's resonating with you. And please use the hashtag FCAN and or TalentStrongFL so we can find you. Finally, this webinar is being recorded. All materials will be shared within a day or so after the webinar has concluded. One other quick reminder, this webinar is set for an hour and a half today. The main part of the content will be in that first hour, but as we suspected, we got a lot of questions around this topic, which is why we allotted extra time. So if you want to hang out and make sure or try to get your question answered in that third half hour, please do so. If you need to drop off at the one hour mark, we totally understand, but just wanted to make sure you knew that there's extra time available for questions. So please make sure you share what's on your mind so we can try to help get your questions answered. Now, for our new listeners today, I know we've got some new folks with us who may not be familiar with FCAN. A little background on us. Our mission is to lead the collaborative movement to ensure every Floridian achieves an education beyond high school and a rewarding career. Our vision is to build a Florida working together where education is the pathway to economic mobility for all. We accomplish our work in three primary ways. First is through our local college access networks, which are cross-sector coalitions of leaders that collaborate to remove barriers and provide more support for student success. Second, we publish research and data on evidence-based practices and policy opportunities to strengthen Florida's talent pool. Finally, through our statewide initiatives, we coordinate 4 of them under the College Ready Florida Initiatives brand that provides schools and community organizations free resources to help students continue their education after high school. Our work is guided by our 7 conditions for success, which you can learn more about on our website. Today's webinar provides great examples of many of these conditions, particularly opportunity for everyone, clear information and guidance, affordability, and community collaboration. Now, to get us started today, it helps to get a sense of, how many students or how big is the need. 98,000 students are undocumented immigrant students graduate from U.S. high schools every year. And it's interesting because when we talk about undocumented students, many folks automatically think Daca, but that only represents one segment of students with undocumented status. So folks are often curious to learn more about what financial aid supports are available because it can be confusing and inconsistent and can change state by state. I know we've got some folks who are listening in from other states today. So to help us level set on the various categories of undocumented students, as well as what financial aid opportunities and other supports are available, we have turned to the experts to help us. So first up, I am so grateful to welcome on the webinar today Luz Corcuera, who is the Executive Director of Unidos Now, a nonprofit organization that's committed to empowering Hispanic Latinos to achieve the American dream through education, integration, and civic engagement. Luz was born in Peru and emigrated to Canada, where she practiced as a psychotherapist for 16 years and remains a clinical member of the Ontario Society of Registered Psychotherapists before moving to Florida in 2000. Luz has a proven track record in community building and engagement. She previously served as program director for Healthy Start Manatee and as a community health director for the Florida Department of Health in Manatee. Luz is passionate about education, health, and cultural competency. Her significant work includes developing and overseeing diverse community-based initiatives to empower underserved and at-promise communities via prevention and education. Luz has been recognized with numerous awards for building strong relationships in the Minnesota region with private, public, faith-based, and civic organizations to close the education achievement gap, reversing negative health trends, and empowering people to civic integration. Luz, so excited to have you joining us today. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Kathy, and thank you for the opportunity to be able to share some of the work that we are doing in the region. Unidos Now, as you mentioned, is a non-for-profit organization, and we've been in existence for about 11 years now. And the reason why we existed is because we recognize that the college and career counselors in high schools are overworked and overwhelmed with 500 kids on their caseload, and most times they are not culturally or linguistically competent counselors. So we work primarily with low-income, first-generation Latino students. So I'm going to ask you to move the next slide, please. Our mission statement is to elevate the quality of life of the growing Hispanic Latino community through education, integration, and civic engagement. Next slide, please. So when we talk about undocumented students and Daca eligible students in post-secondary education, we are talking about an estimated 454,000 undocumented students in post-secondary education across the nation. Around 42,000 undocumented post-secondary students live in Florida and make up about 3% of the state's higher education student population. Only 1 in 3 of Florida's 42,000 undocumented students are eligible for Daca. So that shows that when people are using the term Daca, they need to make a differentiation that there is only a small segment of the population that were able to get all their documentation through the Daca program. Next slide, please. So who is an undocumented student? An undocumented student, if we are going to talk about them, first we need to know who they are. Possibilities are, one, that students enter the United States without inspection or documents that were not appropriate. In some cases, the parents just crossed the river, came with different documentation that did not belong to the child that they were bringing in, or they just changed the names. And sometimes nobody noticed, or they were not able to go through the proper inspection. And they've been living in the United States for several years. Or this could be students that enter with their parents on a visa, on a tourist visa, or under different circumstances, and they overstay their visa. They've been living here beyond their 3 or 6 months or a year permit to be in the United States. Next slide, please. So we have several categories to make the illustration easier for everyone. One group that we call the Dreamers were brought to the United States before the age of 16, and they do not have a lawful immigration status, meaning to say they are undocumented. There is a group that we call the DREAM Act students, and the DREAM Act is a bill, it was a bipartisan bill aimed to provide permanent relief to Dreamers. It has not become a law yet. The DACA group are students that were able to be assigned under the executive order from President Obama in 2012. It provides Dreamers relief from deportation. It gives them a temporary social security number and a work permit, but there is no path to citizenship. The students that are granted to eligible nationals of certain countries or parts of countries are called the TPS, a temporary protection program, and there is no path to citizenship in some countries like Venezuela and other countries are issuing the TPS status these days. Next slide, please. So many college-bound undocumented DACA TPS students have lived in the US most of their lives. They were brought to the US by their parents at a very young age. They learn English and they identify themselves as Americans. And they are Americans in every way, except not having a piece of paper. They attended elementary, middle, and high school in the United States. And most of these students are remarkable people. And I know firsthand some of the students that were about to finish high school and they had tremendous anxiety because they didn't know what their future was holding for them. And because of not having that piece of paper, the students always felt less than and unable to take advantage of the many educational opportunities offered in the United States to high school students. Next slide, please. So what are the steps that students can take when applying for college? First of all, we advise that they research different schools, visiting websites as College Greenlight. College Greenlight is a great resource for undocumented students because it gives them a sense of what colleges are looking for. Prioritize undocumented DACA TPS friendly schools. Selective private schools that meet 100% or a higher percentage of students' financial needs. Not all the schools are able to offer private scholarships. When we talk about state colleges, it's difficult for them to meet what some private colleges are offering to undocumented students sometimes. Apply for the fly-in programs during high school so that they can visit different colleges, they can meet with not only the financial officer, but other people in the colleges to see what are their options. To keep up with immigration news, because sometimes things change and there may be available options that they didn't have the year before. And never underestimate demonstrated interest in a specific college. Next slide, please. Some colleges may consider undocumented students as international students, and they would ask them for the TOEFL exam to see if they are proficient in English, but also they will ask for higher cost of tuition. International students pay 3 times higher the fee of a national student. If a student has attended a high school in Florida for 3 consecutive years, right after graduating from a high school in Florida, and the student applies for enrollment at a Florida institution or higher education within 24 months after high school graduation, they are eligible to request an out-of-state tuition waiver. We've seen some students attending USF that they didn't know about this. They were ready to pay the international student fee. And when they realized that they were eligible, they asked for a state tuition waiver so that they could pay fees that were asked for national students. We have to also mention that most families of undocumented DACA TPS students pay taxes, contribute to their communities in so many ways. But these students end up being at a disadvantage because neither they nor their families are eligible for many federal or state aid programs that they are helping to fund. Though having DACA status and TPS opens up more opportunities. This status still makes the students ineligible for many resources. Additionally, acquiring DACA status or TPS requires money and a good standing in society. People who are granted DACA status or TPS go through biometric screenings, background checks, pay application and renewal fees every year, and are monitored in order to maintain this status. Next slide, please. It is important that the students contact the school's financial aid office to see what they need. Students may be asked to complete the CSS profile. Students that are not eligible for federal or state financial aid, Bright Futures, Fafsa, most scholarships from public universities, they need to know this upfront. If the student has a social security number, they can fill out the Fafsa to receive a report, but they will not be eligible for federal financial aid. And this is something that it's a myth. You know, people say that all students are taking advantage of the system, but that's not true at all. The students also may look into local foundations and documented DACA TPS specific scholarships, sponsors, private scholarships, Lady Scholars, and Quest Bridge. Next slide, please. So I want to go over a case study that really illustrates the work that Unidos now is doing with undocumented students. We have a student when she was enrolled in our Future Leaders Academy program. Her ACT test score was 21. And because she worked 40 hours a week and she carried a heavy academic load in her school, didn't have time to prepare for the test. Her extracurricular activities were non-existent because of her limited time due to work and school. Her grades were the unweighted GPA 3.9 with taking 9 AP classes, remarkable for all the work that she was already doing, including 4 in her senior year. Her essay, in terms of uniqueness, she came to the country 7 years ago and she was working to support her family. The recommendations that she needed, she didn't have any, even though her good grades, but her limited school involvement did not provide a lot of space for teacher interaction. And other factors, she was seeking asylum, but it's a long process. She didn't have any savings, no government aid. And so her chances to go to a somewhat selective college were, very low, 2.0, 2.3. It was better to look for a target school. Next slide, please. Through the work that we customized what she needed to work on. First was to take the ACT test preparation with Unidos Now, attend the practice workshops, and to increase her current ACT score from 21 to 25. In terms of extracurricular activity, we recommended that she gets involved in the Unidos Now club to a target score of 3, and then to keep up with her grades. 3.9 was a very decent GPA and not show any signs of senioritis where students start, not keeping up with their grades. And also her essay, the uniqueness that she had worked on her first draft needed to have more color and imagery to the typical immigrant story. Almost everyone is gonna say, I came to this country when I was 10 years old and my parents did this, did that. That's standard. So her task was to add this uniqueness to portray her character. In terms of recommendations, we suggested that she gets at least 2 letters of recommendation making a request early to her teachers. And also other factors, we suggested that she improve the research to look for a school that was a good fit for her. And so with that, she was moving, her target school slowly. Next slide, please. So after doing all her work, she was in the program for 2 years with us. What we noticed is that she was able to improve her scores. Her ACT went from 21 to 24, which was pretty good. She became involved in the Unidos Now High School Club, becoming its president. Her grades were continued to be kept up, 3.9 GPA, and she maintained the rigor in her classes. Her essay was improved dramatically by showing her uniqueness and showing the amount of work that she was doing as a young 17-year-old woman. And also she requested recommendation letters. So her score in general improved 3.4, giving her a chance to go to a more selective school. Next slide, please. So the result is that she was accepted to Middlebury College, where 15% of applicants are admitted. The ACT mid-range is 31 to 34. Remember that she had 24 points only. The cost of attendance, $75,000 a year. Next slide, please. And she received $300,000 in financial aid. So that really shows that undocumented students can dream big, which is our slogan, and they can aim high. There is an opportunity for everyone. It's just a matter of doing the research and considering all those factors that I have mentioned in the case study. I think, Kathy, my time is up, so I'm going to turn this over to you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, ma'am. Yes, we will have lots more questions coming up for you in a few minutes. But next up, I am thrilled to welcome back our very own Daniel Barkowitz, who's Assistant Vice President of Financial Aid and Veterans Affairs at Valencia College. He is our go-to expert on all things financial aid. For those of you who are not familiar with Daniel, he has served over 30 years in institutions of higher education, including MIT, Columbia, and kind of the greatest hits of the higher ed world. Daniel earned his Bachelor of Science in History from Northeastern University and a Master's of Education in Human Resource Education from Boston University. And with that, Daniel, as you know, many of the questions that came through are specifically around financial aid and how to help students afford going to college. So with that, let me turn the floor over to you.
Great. And thank you, Kathy. Thank you to Luce, who did a great job of sort of orienting us to start. I'm thrilled to have a chance to meet with you today. We're going to talk about financial aid resources for non-U.S. citizens. And as you see from the title flag, these are title slide rather, these are flags from around the world. And I'm going to ask a question and see if anyone can guess this. But what is the name of someone who studies flags? Do you remember the name of someone who studies flags? If you watch The Big Bang Theory, you will remember that Sheldon did a video podcast called Fun with Flags, and he was a vexillologist. So your word of the day is vexillology. You're going to see some flags as we go through our slides today, sort of focusing on the global nature of what we're talking about. So as we dive in, some of you may remember the famous New Yorker cartoon that was pictured as sort of how the New Yorkers saw the world. And the world is basically 9th Avenue to the Hudson River, and then, a little bit of the rest of the country, and then the rest of the world, but really focused on New York. The reason I put this up here is to say, some may view the world as U.S. citizen and not a U.S. citizen. But for financial aid, it's much more nuanced. We need to dive in because the rules differ based on who and where you are in this process. So as we move forward to the next slide here, let's look at what we know about the U.S. population. And, this repeats a little bit of what Lou said. My statistics come from the Kaiser Family Foundation. This is from 2019. If you look at the left side of the chart, non-citizens represent 7% of the U.S. population. And this is nationwide statistics. On the right side, though, you'll see among children, citizen children with a non-citizen parent is 12%, and non-citizen children is 3% of our children population. So again, good statistics as we think about how do we help those students go through the college application process. Let's move to the next slide, if you will, Kathy. So how do we understand this from a financial aid perspective? And this is an image from a paper Fafsa. Probably most of you these days have never actually touched a paper Fafsa. Used to be entirely in paper. But the question about U.S. citizenship status on the Fafsa allows you one of three answers. You can answer, yes, I'm a U.S. citizen. You can answer, no, but I'm an eligible non-citizen, or no, I'm not a citizen or an eligible non-citizen. So the FAFSA introduces this topic of something called an eligible non-citizen. What is that? So, one of my concerns as we talk about financial aid for folks who are not U.S. citizens is that people assume that just because you're not a citizen, you're not going to qualify for aid. And that is not true. There are lots of exceptions, lots of pieces that fall under this eligible non-citizen category. So let's look at some of those on the next slide. So here are some examples, right? To begin with, if you're a U.S. national or a permanent resident, you're an eligible non-citizen. If you have a green card, or you are a native of American Samoa or Swains Island. By the way, extra bonus points if you can figure out which of the flags on the bottom is American Samoa's flag or Swains Island's flag. Number two, do you have an arrival departure that lists one of these following statuses: refugee, asylum granted, Cuban Haitian entrant, conditional entrant, parolee, etc. Do you have a T non-immigrant status, a victim of human trafficking? Are you a battered immigrant qualifying alien? Are you a citizen from the Federated States of Micronesia, Republic of the Marshall Islands, Republic of Palau? So those residents, although they don't necessarily qualify for U.S. citizenship, because they are U.S. territories, they do qualify for financial aid and have a specific status. Let's go to the next slide, please. So you heard Luz talk about international students, right? Technically, who is an international student? Those are students who come to the US from another country to attend college, and they come on usually an F1, F2, or J1, J2 visa. The X1, whether that's F1 or J1, refers to the visa holder, and the X2 refers to the child or dependent of that visa holder. Right? And generally, F1 visas are for full-time international students who are pursuing academic studies, whereas J1 are typically for exchange program students coming through. And to come in, you need to prove usually financial independence to be able to gain entry. Now, we'll talk about some exceptions as we move forward, but that gives you a sense of this. And I know there's been a request, Kathy, for moving back to some of the earlier slides. We'll get a copy of the presentation, I presume, posted online, so you can get a copy of all of these after the presentation is done. So let's move to the next slide. Who's left out then? So we talked about eligible non-citizens. We talked about international students. Who was left out? And so really it's students without documentation of some other status. And that includes, as you heard earlier, DACA students. It includes dreamers. It includes so-called undocumented students, those who have an employment authorization, but that's the only document they have, TIPS or TPS status, withholding of removal, and you can read some of these other statuses that are here. If you fall into, or your student falls into one of these statuses, they are not eligible for federal financial aid, but that's not the end of this conversation. And so I want to move now to sort of how do we help those students? But before we do, one final note. Often there's a point of confusion around whose citizenship matters for financial aid. And I just want to remind all of us, it is the student who matters, not the parents. So if I'm a US citizen because I was born in this country and my parents are not US citizenship or don't have US citizenship, I still qualify for federal financial aid. Even though I might be a dependent student, I might be an 18-year-old, what's most important is what is the student's citizenship. That's the frame that matters when it comes time for federal financial aid. So what can we do about financial aid for each set of students? For eligible non-citizens, they qualify for all types of federal aid, and they can apply using the Fafsa, and there may be other applications they need to do, like the CSS profile or the Florida financial aid application, any school-based financial aid application. International students may qualify for institutional aid. It depends on the institution. So a number of institutions, mostly private institutions, private nonprofit, have a fairly significant budget for international student financial aid. And some colleges may actually ask those students to do the CSS financial aid profile or some other application. They won't, however, qualify for federal financial aid or state financial aid if they're international students. Now, there is an exception. You may have heard of HERF, which is the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund. This is a fund that was given out in response to the pandemic. And under the current administration, eligibility was relaxed so that anyone who's enrolled can qualify. If the college offers that funding to international students, they can qualify. But there's no restriction that it be withheld from international students. So her funding is a federal fund that can be used to help international students pay for their education. It's a limited fund. And after this cycle, there isn't any further funding coming. But for right now, that fund is available. So let's move to the next slide. What about other students, students without documentation? So they won't qualify for federal financial aid or state financial aid. Again, that same HERF exception. right? They may qualify for institutional aid depending on the institution. What I've highlighted here for you here is that in Florida, our state university system institutions, so that's like University of Central Florida, FSU, UF, all of the SUS institutions, they are not allowed to use their own institutional funds to help students without documentation. There isn't that same restriction, though, for state colleges in Florida, like Valencia or like St. Pete or like Broward College. And there is no similar restriction on private colleges. So at my college at Valencia, we do have institutional funds that we help for students without documentation to attend. So, and I'll talk a minute about how do you qualify for those funds if you're applying. And actually, that's the next point. So students without documentation may qualify for private scholarships or foundation scholarships. Colleges generally have a foundation, or there may be community-based foundations, and many private scholarships don't have a restriction on citizenship like federal or state funds do. And finally, as you heard Luz talk about before, some Daca students may be asked to complete a Fafsa. Why is that? Why? Well, because oftentimes there is no other better way to determine a student's need for funds than the Fafsa. And so having that information will be helpful, but the college will let you know if that student needs to complete that form. Now, there is some advocacy right now to try to allow Daca students to be eligible for federal aid. That's happening at U.S. Congress. So, if you have a passion for this, or you think this is important, then you should contact your congressperson and advocate for Daca students to be eligible for federal financial aid. This conversation comes and goes all the time, but given that Daca is a recognized status, that conversation is open and happening. There are specific foundations or agencies like the Dream.us, and that is their website, the Dream.us, that specifically provides scholarship funding to students without documentation. Other than just generalized scholarships, these are specifically targeted for students without documentation. And it's worth looking at those as well if you're a student coming through this cycle or advising a student coming through the cycle. Kathy, next slide. Thank you. What about residency for tuition purposes? So you heard Luz talk about this, and I just want to mention this again. So to qualify for in-state tuition, typically a student needs to prove Florida residency. That's how you get the big break on tuition. And in Florida specifically, that can be reducing your cost by 2/3 to 3/4 from what someone pays from out of state. Usually you have to provide documentation like a driver's license or a passport or a social security card to prove your eligibility. But in Florida, there's a special allowance for those who cannot provide their residency in any other way, as long as they graduated from a Florida public high school and have been enrolled in Florida public high schools for at least 3 years and go right on to college. They can qualify for non-resident tuition waiver, which basically allows them an in-state tuition rate. It does not qualify them for state scholarship, but it does allow them to pay a lower tuition rate as they go through the cycle. And that's very, very valuable. And it is, in a sense, a form of financial assistance because, again, without documentation in some states, you'd be paying the full out-of-state rate. Students who qualify under this waiver can qualify to pay the in-state rate at a significant discount off of what an out-of-state attendee might normally pay. Let's go on to the, thank you. And here are some resources. So again, we'll get you a copy of the slides, so you don't have to take a picture or write these down, but these are a couple of resources I wanted to highlight for you. So the first one, scholarshipsaz.org. This is a list of scholarships they maintain, which generally do not require documentation of U.S. citizenship or eligible non-citizenship status. The Dream.us we talked about before. CSS profile listing is there. And you can look up to see which schools ask for the profile and which schools specifically ask for international students to complete the application. And then these last two resources are resources recommended by the federal government. The first is a U.S. Department of Labor scholarship search, which includes scholarships for students without documentation. And finally, Education USA is a resource for non-citizens who are thinking about studying in the U.S. And with that, Kathy, if we go to the next slide, we will turn it over to Pedro. And I know I'll be back a little later to answer questions that you've submitted.
Absolutely. So lots of questions coming through, folks. So we're seeing them come through, and we will definitely start getting to those in a couple of minutes. But next up, I am thrilled to welcome Pedro Hernandez, who's Director of Outreach Services with the Florida Department of Education Office of Student Financial Assistance. OSFA is in charge of the federal loan portfolio, as well as the nearly 30 state of Florida scholarship and grant programs. Pedro has been with the agency in this role since 2009. He graduated from Florida State University with a baccalaureate degree in international affairs with an emphasis in economics. He has over 20 years of various financial aid experience across lots of institutions and has been an active participant in many industry organizations at the financial aid organizations at the local and national level, as well as the Florida Association of Post-Secondary Schools and Colleges. Pedro, in addition to the institutional and some of the national opportunities that Daniel gave us a quick highlight on, what kind of resources are available through the state?
Definitely, we'll definitely review those. So first and foremost, thank you, Kathy, Daniel, and Luz. Very, very appreciative of all the great information. From the Florida Department of Education, Office of Student Financial Assistance, we first and foremost want to thank you all for assisting all Florida families and students achieve their desired post-secondary goals. So if we go to the next slide. So what are we going to cover today? First and foremost, it will be my pleasure to first and foremost review what the Florida Department of Education's OSFA role is in this entire process. Where do I find financial aid for your students as counselors as well? How and when do you apply, and who could actually help you with that entire process? So let's go on to the next slide. Let's go ahead and begin. So first and foremost, our mission statement here at OSFA is to serve as a guarantor for the FFELP loan program, but more importantly, we are the administrator of Florida scholarship and grant programs. OSFA's mission is to facilitate higher education access and services by providing that exemplary customer attention, comprehensive financial aid information, and convenient and efficient products. So therefore, we here at the Florida Department of Education, we are the administrative branch for all the state scholarship and grant programs. Now, these are all Florida legislatively directive. So that means we here at the Florida Department of Education at OSFA, we do not advocate for or against any legislation. Next slide. So, but what do? OSFA was created and NYFF platform were created to strengthen the financial skills of young adults through financial aid awareness and financial literacy education. So what does that financial aid awareness look like? Let's move on to the next slide to actually go into review that. When it comes to financial aid, we at the Florida Department of Education, Office of Student Financial Aid, want to always inform students that are in this present situation that monies come from, financial aid comes from four major sources. Federal, which is the US Department of Education, and state, which is the close to $1 billion administered here in the state of Florida that most of your students can access at this time. But we strongly always want to reiterate that there is institutional funds out there. There are private scholarship funds out there to assist the students, but there is one exception. So let's go to that one exception. Next slide. When it comes to filling out the Florida Financial Aid application, or the FFAA, we encourage all high school seniors, once again, let me repeat that, we encourage all high school seniors to meet this requirement. It is one of the requirements for the Bright Future Scholarship. Now, yes, it is true that at this present time, if the student is undocumented or non-eligible, they can qualify, but they cannot receive the funding. But what makes that distinction, or why are we here to provide this great information? Because if a student submits during their senior year in high school a Florida financial aid application, which they can submit whether they have or do not have a social security number, the system will assign them a pseudo number if they don't have one. The student can utilize their school ID number if they need to. But by completing this application, it completes the Florida Bright Futures qualifications. Now, Next slide, please. Now, on our website, as you can see, Navigating Your Financial Future, the middle arrow indicates where students would submit their Florida financial aid application or that Bright Futures application. Then once a student has submitted it, they complete the requirements along with all the other requirements. They can always log back in on the arrow on the right-hand side, upper right-hand side of our website, and make sure that they have an application on file. They have correspondence, they have met all the requirements. But when and if the student regains eligibility, they could go to the far left bottom under applications and submit a reinstatement restoration application where they could actually then reinstate their Bright Futures application. Now, since students gaining Bright Futures eligibility for 5 years of funding after high school graduation, that means if a student gains eligibility within those 5 years, a student may reinstate that scholarship for the remaining period within that 5-year eligibility. This is as though the student went out of state. Same scenario, if a student, an eligible student went out of state for 2 years, came back, met all the qualifications, reinstates their Bright Futures application, they then have eligibility for the next 3 years. So that is why it's vitally important that students understand that even though that it's at this present time, yes, they can receive funding for the Bright Future Scholarship, they can still qualify if they meet all the requirements and submit a Florida financial aid application. One of the essential things. Next slide. Now, and finally, who can help you with the process? Student counselors, they could contact us by sending us an email. They could reach us via our 888 line, which is 888-827-2004. And it is my personal commitment to everyone attending this presentation that you have my direct contact information. My name is Pedro P. Hernandez. I can be reached directly at area code 850-245-1821 or by email at pedro.hernandez@fldoe.org. And once again, thank you for everything that you do.
Thanks, Pedro. Great advice in terms of, status can change. And so helping people understand that while they may not qualify for something today, go ahead and apply because they may within the period where they could be eligible again. Great point. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Now, so many times we're talking about serving our students without documentation, and yet it's so helpful to hear from students who've actually been through the process in terms of what it was like for them and what supports they found particularly helpful in terms of helping them realize their college dreams. So that is why I'm so thrilled to welcome on our webinar today, Oscar Portillo, who is a student at University of South Florida. He has a wonderful story to share, and I know you're going to help our folks understand what are the best ways to reach out and help their students with this rather complicated process. So with that, Oscar, welcome, and we'd love for you to share your story.
Thank you so much for having me, Kathy. Hello, everyone. My name is Oscar Portillo. Thank you to all the panelists for speaking on this so eloquently. I am truly inspired to see so many people attempt to hone in this issue, care about it, and work on uplifting the lives of undocumented students across the country. I want to begin by taking a little bit of a step back and thinking about my journey to through the college process when I was in high school. I began applying to colleges and universities probably by the first semester of my senior year. And now that I have the opportunity as a senior in college to reflect on the process, I think one of the most helpful tools that I was awarded with was connection and advocacy. There were so many people who surrounded me in the community that were so willing to both connect and advocate on my behalf with the right resources and the right people so I could accomplish the dream of going to college. From the very beginning, what I mean by connection is connecting me to the necessary sources so I could prep for the ACT, for the SAT, so I could have the necessary and required money to be able to apply to colleges, not just in Florida, but across the nation. Having the right tools to understand what I wanted to study in college, what kind of college I wanted to attend, getting the opportunity to tour some of those schools, to see what they were like, to understand what the campus culture would be like, whether you have to be willing to understand where you're sending your students who are undocumented or international DACA recipients, whatever the case may be. The campus that they attend has to be an institution that understands and is willing to change the way in which it does its work to serve those students best. When I was undergoing the college process, I remember that college and career advisors, college guidance counselors at my high school, and then community members. I'm a scholar of Unidos now. I'm an alumni of the program. All of these institutions came together and held my hand throughout the process. And obviously knowing more than I did about what it was like to apply to college, what it was like to find the right funding, helped me connect with the necessary resources so that I could understand the process and end up at the right institution. I also want to say that the way in which I found the opportunity to be able to pay for college was through a connection in the community, being able to be exposed to the community and having people who were willing to advocate on my behalf. I was able to tap into private donors, private scholarships, all sorts of things that were going to prove fundamental in helping me acquire the correct and rightful amount of funding. Obviously, attending college is an expensive process, but I think being well aware of how the process is done and understanding that some students need some more guidance than others, right? Like many undocumented students will come from first generation families. They will have come to the country 10 years ago. So many of our parents are used to a different college application process, or perhaps some parents didn't attend a higher education institution at all. Those students will need culturally competent and aware counselors, community mentors, and advocates who can help guide them through that process. I was lucky enough to find those resources in the community and to be able to have people who were willing to put in the work to help me understand and guide me through the process. Now, it isn't just about guiding a student through the college application process or helping them find the resources to be able to pay for school, though. It is also about helping encourage and uplift the students. I think one of the most powerful things that I've seen manifest in my own life has been in people who've never stopped helping me believe that, you know, if you dream and you aim high, you can reach it. It's possible. It doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, what zip code you grew up in, or whether the school you attend is highly well funded, or if it's a Title I institution. So if you work as someone who is a college and career advisor or a high school counselor or someone in your admissions department at universities across the country, the one thing you can do, if you can't do anything else, is inspire and uplift students who come from these backgrounds to believe that this dream is achievable and it is possible. I have witnessed the transformational power of education in my own life. I'm actually incredibly happy to share that I began my college journey being undocumented, but thanks to the power of self-advocacy and being willing and capable of telling my story and of finding the correct connections in the community and beyond, I've changed that. I'm no longer completely undocumented. I've actually earned the right to be in the country for the next 2 years, which is an incredible change that you can help accomplish in the lives of so many other undocumented students across the country if you are willing to connect to the right resources and understand the work that needs to be done. When I began at the University of South Florida, the process wasn't easy at all. So you also have to be ready to educate your students, to be empowered themselves to continue that process of advocating for their goals and for their mission of completing a college education. Within my first couple of semesters at the University of South Florida, I had a bit of a difficult time. There were times when the university was not understanding enough of my status, of my my situation. They had not dealt with students before who'd applied without a social security number, or students who had been in the country and graduated from a Florida high school but still had no documentation. Many of those things posed issues where the university would reject payments for my scholarships. There was a semester when I was unenrolled from classes and I had to go back home. All of those things can be quite defeating because many of these institutions are so big that they're not apt or aware of how to deal best with these situations. So if you can find a niche in your campuses, in your high schools where you can talk to people in the community, make them aware of what's going on, offer resources that can help them be more understanding. All of those things will help to change the story on the pages so that that kind of thing doesn't have to be undergone by more undocumented students in the way that I did. It is also, I believe, incredibly important to hone in a lot of knowledge on what this process is like. When I was in my freshman and sophomore years, I was not aware that when you are an undocumented or international student, the university will require you to have health insurance and many other additional fees that you have to pay that, a regular student who is a citizen or an eligible non-citizen won't have to be responsible for. There are ways to cover those or reduce them even that the university doesn't usually know about, or it doesn't write it on the front page about, whether they'll accept an outside health insurance policy that might be $2,000 or $3,000 fewer than what you might pay for the one that is offered by the school. There are resources that can help your students finish up the college process faster. So enrolling your students and advocating for them to be in things like advanced placement classes, dual enrollment, and early college and career preparation courses will be incredibly helpful in helping the college process go faster, be more affordable, and help students continue to learn about the process of being a self-advocate and understanding how to navigate these sometimes turbulent waters. I also think that it's important to I saw a question that someone asked about how we can create local change, change at the state level. I do agree. States like Florida have the ability to expand the eligibility for Florida college aid. And many times it's because we in our communities fail to raise these issues as things that are important and close to our hearts. When I was an intern in the Florida State Legislature, I worked closely with a representative who introduced a bill that was going to expand eligibility for college aid in the state to people who were eligible non-citizens, like Daca recipients and TPS holders, of which we have thousands who are from Venezuela and Cuba and Haiti and the state of Florida, nevertheless in many other places around the country, right? But the bill failed to gain any traction because, frankly, the community did not raise the issue, or it wasn't as important, as something like taxes or whatever else it may be. So continuing to bring these things up to your representatives, to people who you elect when you are in the voting process, will be incredibly helpful. It is a nonpartisan issue. Our communities are stronger, bigger, and better when we have as many talented hearts as possible, putting forth the best of their abilities to contribute as doctors, lawyers. Remember, undocumented students can go on to become anything. They're the teachers of the future, the nurses who fought for patients during the pandemic, the doctors who will treat me one day. So all of these things are incredibly important in remembering when you are advocating on behalf of students who are undocumented. And then also continuing to do exactly this, listening and understanding the stories of students who've undergone this process, and hearing from firsthand accounts of how difficult it may be to make it easier and to make it more flexible and to make these difficult processes far easier to navigate for all students. So I thank you all so much for being interested in listening to this. I think it is incredibly important that you all continue to be more aware and to advocate for students across the nation, and then finding the right places where students will go, right? Whether you're thinking of an in-state institution, who can you contact there so that they understand this process better, right? Is there someone that can speak to your student so that they can navigate the waters with ease? making those connections with counselors, admissions people, college presidents, whoever you can hone into this conversation is going to be crucial for what you can do on behalf of this issue. So keep up this great work. I'm so inspired and made hopeful by all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Oscar. That was wonderful and so so critical about how folks throughout your community supported your efforts, not just the institutions to which you worked with. So with that, I welcome back all of our speakers, Daniel, Pedro, and Luz. And we have, again, lots of questions coming through, and we want to try and get to them, as many of them as we can. For folks, we're not quite at the top of the hour, but I know some folks will need to drop off at 2. That's fine. Those of you who can stay on and engage in our questions, we welcome you to stay. We'll stay up to an extra half hour. So just doing a little bit of housekeeping there. For those of you who do need to drop off, we have another webinar coming up in January, specifically focused on supporting students who are aging out of foster care in the post-secondary process. That will be on January 19th from 1 to 2 p.m. That registration should open up in the next day or so. So if you're not already subscribed to our e-list, floridacollegeaccess.org/subscribe, we'll let you do that. And that way you'll make sure you're not missing any of the things going out in terms of what's coming up. Okay, so folks, you've been seeing lots of questions come through the Q&A as we suspected. You know, one of the, Drusi is bringing up something that I think we hear a lot about, which is folks get nervous about completing the FAFSA and other forms. They are concerned about revealing their status. And in particular, the one Drusi brings up is asylum status. It can actually put their status in jeopardy. And yet, you know, many well-meaning community foundations, which we encourage them to do, require the FAFSA because we're trying to get more people to complete a FAFSA so that they get access to all the money they're entitled to. So Daniel, can we start with you?
How did you know that that was the one I wanted to answer?
I was picking up.
So Drusi raises a really important point. I do want to answer this question because what we often see is a reluctance, and I get it, right? A reluctance to put name and information on paper because there's a concern that somehow information will be shared. And I want to share that there is no information sharing between the Department of Education and any other department at the federal level. So that's first and foremost. There is no information sharing between them. There is matching. There's information matching. But the way this happens is there's a bounce against the database, but information's not shared with ICE, for example. So when you apply for financial aid, there are several database matches that occur, but it's not as though the Department of Education is passing your information to some other area for them to house or hold. This came up specifically, for example, at Valencia this semester when we offered students HERF money. There was a lot of response saying, well, HERF is a federal fund. Can I take this fund? Isn't that going to have some impact on my process if I'm in, if I'm in the immigration process, et cetera? And my response to that is, remember, the Congress is the group, US Congress, that said this was available to students who were undocumented or without documents or students who were international. So if Congress said it was available, that was the guidance we got in writing, it's available. Now, individual attorneys may provide different answers, but that is the state of where we are. So I get the concern, I appreciate the concern. And again, I'd remind folks, there is no data sharing, and it really is about what the intention of the particular fund is at that point, if that's helpful.
Great, thank you. Luz, I know we've gotten a lot of questions on scholarships, and part of what I know UNIDOS now is so good at is recognizing and acknowledging colleges and universities that are welcoming to students without documentation, and helping those students find scholarships and potentially get their whole education funded. So can you talk a little bit more about the process your organization goes through to vet colleges and universities and to help those students find the scholarships for their education?
you, Kathy. Our Future Leaders Academy is a 2-year program. We usually accept rising juniors in high school, so they stay with us for 2 years, which gives us enough time to get to know them, to know their passion, their talent, but also for them to be able to work on a personal assessment and also to make a college list, depending on the careers that they wanted to pursue. We customize every single profile. We do not say, oh, we have a list of colleges that are very friendly to undocumented students. We go by the fact that there are some colleges that are the best fit and the best value for each student. And so according to that, we approach those colleges and on behalf of the students, establish those close relationships. And once they get to know the student, not only to read an essay from the student, but to invite them for an interview and understand the type of a student that we are talking about, they usually fall in love with them. And they will do anything in their power to make them apply to that college, offering the world. And most of the time, it really translates on almost 100% scholarships. Over the years, we've been able to assist the students going to selected colleges, such as Cornell University, Stanford University, Vassar College, Middlebury College. And the students have received almost 100% financial aid from private money, private scholarships. There was one case that 2 colleges were fighting for one student. It was University of Florida and Southern College. They were offering one, trying to top each other. And so finally he decided to go to the University of Florida. He was awarded the highest scholarship that they offer, the Presidential Award, with it included not only tuition, but housing and everything. This student was so remarkable that he ended up applying for a scholarship and going to study in Japan for 6 months. Now he's about to graduate with an engineering degree. So it all depends on the students. As Oscar knows very well, when we accept the students in our program, it's very rigorous. They have to do a lot of work. And one of their tasks is to be able to research those colleges that are really close to their heart, where they are going to thrive. And then make appointments to talk to the admissions people, the financial officers, and sometimes we invite them to give workshops for our students. So that's how we do it. We do not have a list of colleges that we say, oh, these colleges are very friendly. It all depends on each student. Oscar applied to 26 colleges and he was accepted in all of them. Isn't it true, Oscar, when you did that? Right. And he decided to stay with USF because it was what he needed at that time. It was the best fit college for him.
Oscar, you want to share a little bit about that process for you and how you went about finding the institutions you were interested in? And then, as you got those offers, how did you start to weigh what was the right fit for you?
Absolutely. Utilizing resources like the Common App, those general applications that you can utilize to send to a bunch of different colleges, where you get to see what the institutions are like, what kind of majors they offer, what your interests are. You can submit, your essay that you've worked on, hopefully to tailor, which I got a lot of help with from both people, in the high school offices that I worked with, alongside my mentors at Unidos. I made the decision to apply to colleges that, around the nation, see where I would best target myself for my own needs, based on what I wanted to study. So I applied to schools. I'm super interested in like politics and stuff. It's actually, the end of my career. So I applied to colleges in Massachusetts, in Washington, across Florida. I think I tried to hit almost all of the state universities. Then, areas that were going to be culturally competent for my needs, honestly, because it's something that is incredibly important, right? Like there are sometimes you have to be aware of what place might be welcoming and understanding of what you're going through, right? So, and then how much of a need the institutions have previously met for students. Are there stories that resemble yours or those that of the students that you're working with. Those are going to be incredibly important questions that you have to both ask and answer while applying. I think I ended up receiving about $1 million in total scholarships from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, Florida Southern College, Rollins College, but I decided to go to USF because it was, affordable. It was the institution that I fell in love with after I toured it. It met the needs that I had, and it has ended up being an incredibly welcoming and very awesome place to be at, genuinely. So when your students are making that decision, attempting to get them that exposure to what the institution might be like, and then whether the institution has previous case studies, right, in helping students who are in this situation is going to be really important in their success.
Daniel, one sec. Oscar, you had talked about cultural competency a few different times. So did you prioritize Hispanic serving institutions? Were you looking for institutions that had, for lack of a better word, clubs or other forms of support for students so that you had that kind of built-in support system?
Absolutely. And I think that's a particularly important thing to, look out for, because if the institutions don't understand the kind of students that they're serving, it's going to be very difficult for the student to navigate the path, especially, right? Many undocumented students are going to be first generation. So they don't have that parental guidance that many other students are so blessed and lucky to have. Many of them will come from high schools where the resources and the funding are just simply not there to have had the opportunity to have direct interactions or constant interactions with college and career advisors and guidance counselors who can help you navigate the process and prepare you for what's coming in the future. So I chose USF because of its diversity. It this year has actually been ranked as the #1 institution in the state of Florida for international students, which just shows USF's prowess in serving, a multitude of communities. So understanding those things, looking out for those statistics, what kind of students do they serve? Are there students from your country, or students who are undocumented that have told their story before, that have attended these institutions that you're looking out for? That's going to be really important in cementing your student's decision, because they will go on, right, when they've left the nest of high school, to be welcomed at a campus that is going to have the right offices and people to navigate any questions that they might have. Because remember, many students are starting off without a lot of that guidance that other students are very lucky to have. So that's going to be incredibly important.
What I love about what you're sharing, obviously, many of us are in the position where we have students talking to us about how they're going to afford a college or university, and yet we want them to be successful once they're there. And so I think what you're bringing up is so important, and Luz touched on it earlier, is that fit question. It's not just finances, but where do they feel like they would fit and belong? So great way to kind of fill in that part of the story. Daniel, I know you wanted to jump in there.
Yeah, the other thing that I just want, and this question has come up sort of in the questions as well. So I appreciate and recognize that private institutions who are high cost generally have a lot of scholarship they can offer. So, when I worked at MIT, we had basically an unlimited budget for international students. Whatever the international student need was, if we accepted them, or undocumented students, we funded them. But that was the nature of MIT. Now, that said, MIT's cost these days is $80,000 a year, so they have high cost, but they have high aid. So the other model, and I'm not discounting anything that's already been said, I think that's valid and extremely important. The other model is to plan for low cost, but probably lower aid. So, that's an equally valid choice and process for students who may not be able to qualify for significant merit-based aid. You can still attend someplace like a Valencia college, right, that has, a relatively low cost and probably still qualify for some scholarships, possibly. So just, not that my job today is to promote Valencia, it's not, but I just want to make sure that it's clear. I've worked at both kinds of institutions, and your pathway and your model as a student might be in that direction, or it might be in this direction. And really, you need to examine the possible fit of all of those types of institutions. I think it's really important just to put that there.
And Pedro, I'm going to get to you in one sec. For those who did not listen into our financial aid training for counselors earlier in the year, Daniel does go into that in more detail in terms of high cost, high scholarships, lower cost, and kind of looking at the netting out if you're really looking at what's the financial bottom line for you. So if you want more information on that, you should be able to find that on our Florida FAFSA Challenge page. Okay, Pedro, please jump in.
Definitely. Just wanted to reiterate what Oscar and Daniel have said, because that is so vitally important, because we understand that certain students want to attend a high-end academic institution, but if they're not high academic student or high student, that's not a perfect match. And there are other roads, such as a state college or even a technical center. The thing that we wanted to absolutely make sure is how proactive both Oscar was and Daniel is, and we all are, in assisting and trying to make that match for those students. Yes, but it also is going to be has on the student to actually speak out and say, I would like to do this, and therefore we could actually work with those students. And that's what we're always here for. I know Daniel and his staff work with a lot of students. I work with a lot of students, a lot of parents in guiding and answering a lot of those questions about, we don't advise where to go or what to go to school, but we advise them of the possible path and the possible sharing of information. And those are essential to get that information out.
Great, thanks. Yeah, that's super helpful. And again, I think for some people, it can be a scary process. So clarifying that the information is not shared is helpful. Luz, I know part of what we talked about, certainly in promoting this webinar, is the idea that K through 12, particularly our high schools, our higher ed institutions, and community-based organizations like yours really can achieve better results for our students when we're working together and collaborating. Can you talk a little bit about the community collaboration you all are doing with other organizations in your community, as well as your education partners?
Thank you, Kathy. I think collaboration is the only way to go. No one can achieve anything in isolation. We all are very well aware that we need each other because we have different strengths and we understand different challenges as well. For Unidos Now, being such a small organization with a very small, hardworking, talented team, we still have to rely on our community partners. And we've been very fortunate that being able to serve both counties, Sarasota, Manatee, we have a strong partnership with the school district in each county, but also with other youth development organizations. The local colleges have been incredible. Right now, we are housed in an office in the newest campus at the State College of Florida. They have this new Center for Advanced Technology and Innovation, and we are housed there. We have a small office that we have access to these wonderful facilities that have the latest of technology that would allow us to do hybrid programs, offering in person and online at the same time. So it's because of these partnerships that we are able to really have a meaningful impact in the community. Now, our idea is to start very early. So that's why we have established programs in the elementary, middle school, and high school, creating this pipeline of higher education. And our students who are in college, like Oscar, are coming back and giving back to the community. They are inspired the younger generations that dreaming big is necessary and possible, that if you put the work into it and you do everything that you need to do, that we tell you to do, we say, if you follow to the teeth what we are telling you to do, we promise you that you will be in good shape. I also want to make clear that we are not only advocating, I've talked so much about selective colleges. We are not only advocating for four-year college degrees, we are also advocating for two-year college degree or high-quality certifications, because every student has the right to follow their passion. They need to know what they like, what they are good at. And there's one student that we had in our program who applied, went through the interview, and she said, I know exactly what I want to do. So I don't need to attend all your workshops. I don't need all this mentorship. I know that I like to work on people's heads. So I'm going to be a hairdresser. I want to go straight to Manatee Technical College. And so don't invest in me. So what do you say to that? Fantastic. I am so glad that you are only 15 and you already know what to do. Make sure that in the process, you love this, what you want to do. And she does. To this day, she's finishing that certification. But it's all about having this close relationship with the student. And we rely so much on our community. Without our mentors, our students could not be where they are today. Our mentors are incredible. And also in Unidos now, we've now changed a little bit our model because we have students who are brilliant. They have gone through the process. And now we have 5 of them being college coaches for our students. So it's a way for them to give back to the community, but everyone can relate to them because they are young. They can tell their stories that Oscar has mentioned, those horror stories. One day I was abroad and I got a text message from Oscar. He said they are asking me to move from my dorm and they want to return the check to Unidos now. So crazy things that happen, but students like Oscar who have the skills to advocate for themselves, they don't just sit there and cry. They go and just fight for what they need to fight about. So the community is extremely important. Through our local college access network in Manatee, Rich Manatee, and in Sarasota, Planet Sarasota, we have amazing partners. And I think together we can do more than alone.
Well, and one of the things that you've talked about is something as basic as really encouraging your students and helping them know that it's possible. So I was just about to call on Oscar, but I'm worried we lost him. Oscar, if you're still there, let us know. If you're not, we will. There he is. In starting this process, it can be overwhelming for any student. Can you talk a little bit about, when you first began, did you automatically know you wanted to go to college? What was that like, and who informed your thinking and your decision making? And obviously you've become a great advocate for your needs. Were you always that way? Was that a Unidos now and their amazing work? Talk a little bit about that part of your story.
So I think you get to the heart of this perfectly. When you have an organization or someone in the community that is doing this work, it is important to recognize, right? And this is going to sound like a pat on my back, but it is very important to recognize when you have students who have the talent and the ambition and the willingness to do the work, right? Like that is something that I know Unidos looks out for. It is students who are, the cream of the crop, like students who have great grades and are willing to put in the work to take the ACT, the SAT once or twice or however many times it takes to get that perfect score. So recognizing that talent and then connecting it to the appropriate resources is very important. I always knew that I wanted to go to college. I do believe that you have the opportunity to have an incredibly rewarding career if you don't go to college. But I do also know from the perspective of my family and being a first-generation American, the power of education has the ability to transform your lives. My journey in college hasn't just given me an education. I've sat next to governors and state representatives and senators and university presidents to talk about these very issues, and I wouldn't be able to do that without my college education. It has given me both the power and the ability to speak on these issues clearly, to understand the intricacies of how they can be resolved, and to be able to propose solutions to the problems that we face, right? Like, so it's a multi-part approach to the problem, right? So understanding how to target your talent at your high school level, and even before, Unidos has a multi-generational approach where it works with parents and students in elementary school all the way up through high school, identifying that talent early and connecting it to the resources and figuring out what that student wants to do. We just had a presentation from a very young girl, I believe she's maybe 7 or 8. Unidos has worked to understand what her likes, what her desires are for her career. She's been exposed to marine biology programs even before she's in high school. So understanding what your students want to do at an early stage is going to be really important in helping them figure out what it is or where it is that they want to go. I knew that I wanted to study something in the humanities, like political science, economics, history, all of those things. So when I was able to speak clearly to my college and career advisors and the counselors, they helped me navigate that path better. So I knew where to target and where to apply and what to write about in my essay. In my college essay, I talked about my very first experience on a political campaign. So those were things that I don't believe I would have been able to do. I probably would have talked about something else rather than something very particular and special, had it not been for the guidance that I received from the people who were aware about how to go through the process.
Well, I second your recognition of our school counselors. We have many of them on the call today. They have an unbelievably heavy caseload and yet are still so committed to their students and helping them find the right future for themselves. Pedro, Laura was asking in the Q&A about how do you help those students who aren't quite sure, they may not be the top students yet. Many times what engages a student is them finding that career path or that future that does excite them and then connecting the education that can help them achieve those goals. So what are your thoughts in terms of how do you help those students potentially find what that future or several futures could be for them so that education starts to make more sense?
Definitely. One methodology to utilize is a lot of counselors in the state of Florida, when it comes to advising students as early as 9th grade, they start advertising that students need to complete community service hours or service hours for their Bright Futures requirements. Sometimes students indicate that they have no idea what they possibly could be. Others have the exact opposite opinion. They want to be everything in the world. So if you narrow it down, get some industries, get some associations or some companies or some nonprofits that they would work with, have them do a couple service hours and see if that sparks an interest, if that's what something they want to do. If they want to enter the medical profession, if they want to enter the business profession, if they want to enter a political profession, have them do those service hours, get a taste, get an experience in something. And at the same time, they're completing a requirement for Bright Futures for the school and sometimes for graduation. Those things always spark an interest. At least if it doesn't, that means that you could check that interest off. But you have to also remember, these are students that even in high school, even in college, change their majors drastically. But with a general, good rounded education, good rounded experience, they can make better decisions. And if they have questions or concerns, it empowers those students to raise their hands and to communicate. Yes, I really like that. No, I didn't really like that. Or yes, I like this aspect of a profession. And that makes a significant difference. And then they can start narrowing down schools, majors. It's a concept that we would love to start in late middle school, but as early as 9th and 10th grade. Because when they come to 12th graders, they have a very finite definition time that they would address.
And that's part of why we started Planet Florida, is for exactly that reason, to help students get started earlier. Daniel.
So I wanted to share an acronym, and I think, Oscar, your essay is a perfect example of this, and it speaks to what Pedro talks about. So I get questions lots of times about what should students write an essay about? What should they discuss in their essay? And the acronym I suggest, and Luz, you may have heard me talk about this before or not, is the word POEM. And it sort of speaks to exactly this point. It's POEM. And what I mean by that is passion. What do you have a passion for? Right? The O is opportunity. Where did you have a chance to begin to explore that passion? Right. And so for you, Oscar, it was clearly sort of political activism, right? And, in that piece. So where's the opportunity? What's the single experience? So in the big opportunity, what was the one day, one experience, one moment? Well, moment's coming, but one time when, you had that chance What did you learn from that experience? And the last one is moment. And what you really want to write about is the moment. What is the moment in that experience through that opportunity following your passion where something clicked, where you realized, I want to go back to something Luz said earlier about the student in her case study. We often, as counselors, advise students to write, or sometimes students think they have to write about trauma. They have to relive trauma. They have to put something about how they succeeded despite the obstacles. And that's great, but that's an essay that every admissions officer reads all the time. So if you're going to do that, you need to do it exceptionally well. And there are very few people who can talk about trauma. I know I'm not one of them. I can't talk about trauma and, exceptionally well. I'm much better following my passion and talking about the things I'm passionate about. So if that's helpful for folks, I'll offer that as a sort of easy acronym to remember: POEM, passion, opportunity, experience, moment. And if you follow that funnel, you'll get to the piece that you can really write about and experience, both for scholarship essays, by the way, as well as your admissions essay.
Wonderful. I'm right there with you that I think there's somewhere along the line, it's kind of become conventional wisdom that you need to uncover whatever is the worst thing that happened in your life and talk about it. And that's not the only thing you can write about. It doesn't mean that's a bad idea. At the same time, I don't want any student to have to feel like they have to re-traumatize themselves in order to get a college education or earn a scholarship. So I love that acronym because it allows them to focus on their strengths and what they're good at instead of hashing up something that they might not be comfortable sharing. As we're kind of winding down our time, Oscar, that concept kind of made me think about, a lot of students don't know themselves that they're undocumented until they go through this process or are about to start this process, and or are uncomfortable revealing their status. And I don't want to ever feel like we're encouraging people to do something that's going to put them in jeopardy. Do you have thought, I remember a school district, and I can't remember which one, a while ago shared that rather than expecting a student to out themselves, so to speak, they provide the information regardless of documentation status to all students so that students can self-select who wants help. Do you have other thoughts like that in terms of how to help students without necessarily re-traumatizing them or expecting them to reveal a status they might not be comfortable revealing?
I think the most powerful thing that I found when I was undergoing the process was acceptance, right? And that is a difficult thing to teach because you will have students that are in areas around the country where you might just not have as many people who understand, or the resources are there. I know there are some states where legislation will come through where you just can't talk about these issues. So I think doing it in a way that makes students feel safe, discreet, and comfortable is going to be very powerful. In Florida, if you're looking to do this in the state of Florida, you might be able to do it more openly because I think, there are a multitude of people in high schools and at the colleges and universities across the state who have come across this, this particular issue now, so they understand more. But doing it in a way that makes your students feel safe and accepted, and providing them the resources so that they explain, right? I love that we had a conversation about how financial aid does not cross over information to ICE or any of the law enforcement agencies, talking about the great work that has been done in states like Florida. And this is a non-partisan, non-political, none of those things. This is not that kind of issue. It is about determining the future of students who have potential in the same way that you would, if a student was documented or not. It's just about getting students the right resources, right, and helping them find the avenues on where they'll go. So I think what you suggested, being able to provide that to students in a way that they understand, though, right? Because again, remember, many of these students will come from first-generation families where the guidance just won't be there, even if the parents are very attentive. it just might not exist because the process of applying to college in Colombia is going to be incredibly different to how you do it in the US, right? So making all of the information available and then offering it to students and being a welcoming, career advisor or college guidance counselor who has an open space so that students can come to you and openly talk about these issues is going to be really, really critical in how they will proceed. So if you're able to do that and you have the power to do that, you have a chance to transform the future and the career of a student who might be facing this.
Yeah, great. Well said. Luz, we only have a minute left. One of the things that I always appreciate about you is obviously your organization has worked with so many students and you have such a passion for them. Let's finish on that high note, sing the praises of your students and why this is so important to invest in supporting them.
So the reason why I joined Unidos Now in 2016 was not because of the money, because I inherited an organization that only had money for 6 months. So my job was to make sure that we had a financial sustainable path. But I joined Unidos Now because I understood that the Latino population continues to grow, that the kindergarten enrollment is almost at 40% Latino in Sarasota, Manatee, and DeSoto counties. And the childbirth rate in the Latino women is higher than any other ethnic group. So this is our future. I have selfish reasons. I don't want to age old and not having these wonderful, talented kids being my doctor, my accountant, my advisor, my priest, whatever they choose to be. I want to make sure that we all foster this young talent. And if the students were not born in the United States for whatever reason, they are more Americans than we think. They embrace the American values and they are the leaders of tomorrow. Leaders like Oscar that have the talent, the kindness, the compassion, everything that it's all about what makes America great. So I want to make sure that we all walk away from this workshop with a lot of optimism, knowing that our future is in great hands. And if you work in higher education and you're not paid well, if you are an educator and you're not appreciated, please know that what you are doing is so important. It's the most important profession in the world. And I want to thank you, Kathy, and all our community partners for caring about the students that really matter. Every student is important, but those who have the grit, like Oscar, who are not the cream of the crop. By the way, when they come to Unidos Now, they don't think they can even go to college. They do not believe in themselves. It's only when we start believing in them that they start believing in themselves. Not everyone is as confident as Oscar, but by the time they are done with the program, as Daniel was saying, they don't leave or relieve their trauma. They focus on their strengths and they are able to establish their own brand to show the uniqueness. And these students, I promise you, are incredible. They are worth to listen and worth to support. So let's work together to make sure that we have an educated next generation of leaders, and let's enjoy the moment. And I want to take advantage and wish you all a happy holiday. I think we should be very proud of all the work that we are doing.
Wonderful. Thank you, Luz. I really appreciate it. And I also want to say a special thank you to all the folks who are tuned in today. You tuned in today, you registered because this topic mattered to you and your students matter to you. So we celebrate you as well. We're concluding our time. So many thanks to Pedro, Luz, Daniel, and especially Oscar for sharing and helping us understand more about how to help our students who lack the documentation they need. We are putting together a follow-up webinar in February. I don't have a date for you yet, looking at this from the college level. How can colleges make themselves more welcoming to students who lack documentation status? So with that, have a wonderful holiday season, and we'll look forward to seeing you in the new year. Thank you, everyone. Take care now.